Welcome, everybody. Very excited to be leading on the Seedcamp podcast today and to have an amazing guest, Maria Bogu, who has an illustrious career across many major tech brands that you all have heard of, such as Microsoft and Monzo. And for the last 3 years, she's been leading product at Spill. Maria is also a qualified counselor and is training to be a therapist. Now, why is that relevant? Well, it's because Spill works with employers to provide easy access to high quality mental health support. And what does that do? It creates a better culture around mental health within organizations. It, helps people with mental health training and regular feeling check-ins. I think, especially after the last year and a half, I think the conversation around mental health has become all the more, at the forefront, which is incredibly important. It's about time that is happening. And across the health tech space at Seedcamp, we've been exploring all different areas. And this is a space that we're particularly passionate about and interested in as well. And we are very excited to have Maria here with us today to really dig into the intersection of, mental health and tech and how the two combine. So hi, Maria, welcome.
Hello.
Very excited to have you with us. Maria, I'd love to just kick off with, asking you to give us a bit more info about Spill and what drew you to join the team 3 years ago.
Well, so as you were saying, Spill, we created Spill to help as many people as possible get very, very easy, quick access to high quality mental health support. Click button, talk to therapists is how I talk about it a lot of the time. Just make it as easy as possible. And then going a step further beyond that, after removing the physical barriers to speaking to a therapist by making it very, very easy to book a session, working towards removing some of the psychological barriers to speaking to a therapist, the stuff that's around how we think about therapy, what we think therapy is for, how it can help us, how we think about mental health more generally, how we think about emotional intelligence, being proactive about managing how we're feeling. So that's where Spill goes a step further, and it's trying to, help people do the healthy, correct, right behavior by design. One of the things I found over the last few years working in this space is that in the wellness industry, there's a lot of finger wagging, kind of eat your vegetables, you must do this, you must do that. I don't think that's the reason why people don't do these things. It's not because we don't know that we have to get enough sleep and drink enough water and exercise regularly, etc., that we don't do these things. I think it's because there are many forces pulling on us day in, day out, and it's, a lot of times structurally difficult to do the correct thing. And so that's where Spill takes a slightly different approach. We try to think, okay, well, how can we actually help people do the right thing? And that's what we're doing in businesses. This is what I mean about the second step of, after you've removed the physical barriers, of making it very easy for people to access high quality mental health support, you then start working on these psychological barriers, which are to do with the culture around mental health, about how people think about therapy, how they can employ therapy, manager training, for example, checking in with people regularly and helping them check in with themselves, and doing all of this by building tools that help us do these behaviors by design is a way to kind of help people do the good behavior rather than telling them that they should do.
I think that's such a good point, right? And people, as you say, we know we should do the right thing, but we don't. And how you build products that, and design and structurally make it easier for people to take the right action without forcing them to do something, that they fundamentally don't want to do is a really tricky line to balance. So I guess, how do you define the product vision at Spill, and how do you think about the balance of, the eat your vegetables?
Eat your vegetables, but don't make it, don't nag people. And in fact, that's one of the principles, one of the core product principles we've got at Spill. The phrase is "don't nag, help," and we say this, I think, at least once a week, there will be a meeting about something and someone will say, don't nag, help. And it's because that's the vision. The vision is that you build a product that helps you do the right behavior without nagging. It's by design made so that it helps you get there without just constantly sending you push notifications to say, do this, do this, do this. So that's where we'd like to get to, is having a variety of tools that are easy into doing the right behavior. You know, in the same way that, and kind of to think of examples of things that have done this. I think Monzo is a good example, actually. It's a product I'm familiar with, but you know, one of the good behaviors in having good financial habits is to keep track of your spending. And you could be telling people you must keep track of your spending and nagging them to do it. But what Monzo did instead is they just designed a good solution that helped people do that, you know, by design, and that encouraged people to have healthier financial habits. And I guess it's still, we kind of, you know, we hope to achieve the same kind of thing, which is help people do the correct behavior by design.
It's really interesting that you bring up Monzo. Obviously, you know, beautifully designed product, and, you know, been very successful, and people love it because a lot of these design cues and the way the product's been built. I'd love to know some of your thoughts around, you know, or differences perhaps in having worked as a PM at Monzo and in the fintech sector, and now building healthcare. Like, can you talk to some of the differences in how you build in the one versus the other, as well as potentially some of the similarities?
Yeah, actually, the similarities are the ones that come to mind first, surprisingly enough, perhaps. But why am I thinking that? I guess both industries have a strong component of duty of care. It's maybe not the first thing you think about when you think of a bank, but banks have a duty of care. It's enshrined in law. It's regulated by the FCA. They have to be mindful of how they interact with customers. So, for example, all financial institutions, I worked in on overdrafts. You have to be very careful about causing people to go into debt. And so you have to be mindful of things like, you know, if you're dealing with vulnerable people, people who are struggling with a mental health problem, for example, maybe they're struggling with addiction, and you have to be very careful about gambling debts. And if you're offering credit to people who might not be able, because they're in a vulnerable place, to handle having access to lots of credit. So in the financial industry, there is this duty of care, and we had to think a lot about how do you build things responsibly, you know, down to details such as making sure that you balance building a product that's easy to use and you can tap and get an overdraft against making it so easy that it's then too easy for some people to get into debt. So balancing those two things against each other and trying to find the right place on that continuum for the product. Now, similarly, mental health has a duty of care, and you know, we're constantly having to think about how do we best serve people, especially people may come to spill when they're in a particularly vulnerable place. So we have to be, you know, extra careful about how we think about the whole experience. Now, the surprising thing is, one of the differences actually is the fact that the financial industry is actually more regulated than the mental health industry. The FCA, you know, I was talking about this duty of care, and the FCA makes it law. You have to abide by these rules. You know, you have to be mindful of who you give credit to and who you don't. In the mental health space, at least in the UK, the space is, there's a lot less regulation enforced in law. So for example, whilst in America, a licensed therapist is a term protected by law, the term counselor and therapist in the UK aren't. The term psychologist is, but the terms counselor and therapist aren't protected by law. There's various policies in draft, and it may become regulated by law in the next, I don't know, few years, but it isn't at the moment. And so lots of the regulation is created by the licensing bodies, the registration bodies, but they're guidelines. So very much you promise to follow these guidelines, but you don't have the same. They don't have the same kinds of powers as the FCA's to make them law. And what that means is actually that we have a higher responsibility to make sure that we police ourselves and that we abide by these ethical guidelines, because there isn't as much infrastructure to tell us step by step what to do. It relies a lot more on clinical judgment and us, kind of thinking about what's the right thing to do by the client. So actually, yeah, you have a lot more responsibility on your shoulder in the mental health space, but I don't know, maybe surprisingly, it's because there's less regulation about it.
That's so interesting. I had absolutely no idea. I would have thought, obviously within the financial sector, and as you say, like needing to protect people who might be vulnerable, because there are vulnerabilities in both spaces. But it's so crazy that doesn't exist in when it comes to mental health and well-being. And I guess, even more credit to those of you like Spill who are actually really thinking about the ethics in product design as you're building, and a much higher responsibility, as you say, to kind of police yourselves. I guess that sort of leads me on to the next question, which is, how do you integrate that responsibility and the kind of ethics and quality of the therapists into the product, into Spill?
So kind of how do you balance out the user experience against your responsibilities in terms of like the ethical guidelines and
yeah, I think on that, as well as then when you're onboarding therapists, the sort of process you as an organization put them through too, from the product and how they'll interface with it as well.
Okay, well, let me try and break that down a bit. So I guess one of the things we do is we start with, I asked me at the beginning what the vision with Spill is, and I think one of the things that sets Spill apart from other mental health startups is that we put clinical judgment at the core of everything that we do. One of the principles, one of the beliefs, I guess, that we hold quite dear is that if you purport to actively help someone who is struggling, then you need to, at least at some point in the process, you need to have had a human being who cares about helping the other person. And technology is there to enable those clinicians, those people to help people as effectively as possible and to help as many people as possible. So the role of the technology there is to expand that care to lots of people and to maintain that quality bar. But the root of everything, the foundation of everything is the clinicians who care about the people that they're trying to help. And this, I think, is, you can see this in the fact that our adherence to the ethical guidelines, for example, it's very much, every therapist who works at Spill is qualified and registered with an accreditation body, and in doing so they abide by these ethical guidelines, and that comes first. Above any kind of business consideration, like client comes first. It's very much, sort of Hippocratic oath kind of thing. It's like we promise to do the best by the client, and that's the therapist's like first concern, and how best to serve that client. And then everything else, you kind of build the business around that, but that comes second. You always start with the client and then concerns first. And then when you have that clear commitment, I guess, the fact that you always start with the client, you always start with the tech world calls this person a user, but in therapy world, you'd call them a client. So when you have this clear delineation that you always start with the person you're trying to serve, then it makes these decisions a lot simpler. How do you balance what the client wants with what the business is capable of doing and the business constraints and so on. Whenever you're having to resolve these, kind of find a balance between all of these competing needs, it's simple to resolve them, because you always ask yourself, what's the best thing that I can do by this person we're trying to serve? And I guess there's several subsets of this problem that are kind of interesting. One of them is the fact that because we work in the wellness space, there is an element of kind of a contradiction, I guess, where people want to do the right behavior, but they often kind of also at the same time don't want to do it. It's very much I want to go to the gym, but I don't want to go to the gym. I want to eat my vegetables, but I don't want to eat my vegetables. And Spill has to figure out how to balance, how to empathize with both parts of our psyche, basically, the part of us that wants to do the right behavior and the part of us that is reluctant to give up the time to do it. And an example of this would be, for example, proactively looking after your mental health. One of the things that we try to get people to do is to not wait until they've broken down and then come to therapy, because at that point, you're doing a lot more damage control. It's a lot more reactive. You don't have as much scope for changes because a lot of stuff's already gone wrong. So we're trying to get people to act earlier. Obviously, the earlier you urge people to act, the less incentive they have to act, because they're not in as much pain. So then they're like, well, it's fine, I'm not going to do it now because I can do it later. And you're like, no, but you don't want to do it later because later will be harder to solve. So we're trying to balance that out. And one of the ways we do it is what I was saying before, trying to do it by design, just like find fun, simple ways in which you can insert those good behaviors without also introducing loads of friction. So this is like one of the regular check-ins that we help people do as an example of this, how we try to help people do this. So that's one of the examples of how to balance like what people want versus what they don't want. But I don't know, but like both desires, I guess, belong to the same person. It's kind of one of these internal contradictions that we all hold. Another example, I guess, is around I don't know, like, I guess around how you're asking, how do the clinicians, how do the therapists come into all of this, and how do you integrate them into the product? I think the continuum here is maybe around how do you use technology to leverage the power of clinicians so that you can help more people more effectively. I think that's one of the things that we try to do at Spill, and that's kind of how technology comes into this. Because traditionally, therapy is you get 1 minute of therapist in and 1 minute of client value out. It's a kind of one-to-one relationship. And being able to turn that from 1 minute equals 1 minute into 1 minute equals 10 minutes of value for the user, then if you can manage that, that's fantastic. So these are one of this category of problems is one of the things that Spill's been working on. How can you get therapists to reach more people and more effectively? And once again, it's holding the fact that it always starts with the clinical care, with the therapists sitting there thinking about someone and about how can I help this person. And then you try to use technology in, okay, how can we effectively reach like lots of people? How can we catch them early? How can we reduce the time it takes to find a particular way to talk about grief, for example, or anxiety, and make that quicker so that therapists can reach more people more effectively.
So many really interesting things to unpack there. I think on
as a therapist would say, so much to unpack.
Oh, I've got the lingo down. 20 minutes and I'm already getting to talk. No, but I think, how you talk about the actual designing for people to engage at the moment when it's not desperate, because as we know, right, at the point when you're breaking down, it's very difficult. Whereas actually the maintenance and looking after your mental health in the same way you would look after your physical health is a muscle that we need to train that we're just not used to doing. And I think keeping it fun and simple is a great way to be thinking around the product design and how you facilitate that. But actually there's a real change in, client behavior that you need to be driving here as well, right? Which is not only proactively taking control of it before it's desperate, but also that it's using tech and that it's sort of in chat and in Slack. So how have you thought about how you bridge the gap, or you take clients on that journey to make them more comfortable with this sort of behavior or product that they're probably very unused to?
Yeah, you mean how do you build trust with people to get them to actually use the product? Yeah, I mean, that is a great question, and I'm sure one that we'll be working on for years and years from here on out. Yeah, I mean, trust, how do you build trust? I mean, they say trust is consistency over time. And I really like that way of thinking about trust, because I find it quite actionable, I guess. Kind of think, okay, well, trust is consistency over time. So it means that you stop thinking about the user's interaction with the product as a snapshot in time, photograph, like this particular interaction. And instead you expand it to a series of interactions. So you kind of add a time dimension and you think, okay, well, rather than just this one interaction, let's think about how this looks over time and all of the number of interactions the user will have with the product. And we have a couple of, like, for example, our regular feelings check-in, kind of inbuilt in the way we do it is that the user keeps coming back and has multiple interactions. And so you actually have a bit of a story there. You don't just have like this one time, okay, one interface, I've got to convey trust, I've got to somehow, I don't know, pick the right way of rendering information so people trust the product immediately. You kind of think about, okay, how can I build trust over time? How can I be consistent over time so that people slowly get to trust that this is a product that is working on my behalf. And I think it's the same as we do with people. How do you trust a person? Well, the answer is probably you don't to begin with. And then you trade in pennies, you talk about the weather, you disclose some inconsequential piece of information, and then watch to see how they're going to treat that piece of information. Are they going to be respectful of it? Are they going to be interested in it? Are they going to be kind of careful about not disclosing it to the first person that comes along? And then if you see that they're doing that, then that's great. And then you maybe disclose a little bit more, and then maybe the other person reciprocates, and so on and so on. And you kind of build this trust over time by being kind of consistently trustworthy in every single interaction. So you take exactly that and just apply it to a product. How do you build trust with a product? Well, you don't trust it to begin with, and then you start having these micro interactions, and then you see how the product treats that piece of information. And if you see, okay, like Spill seems trustworthy, they're being very clear and transparent about how they're using my data, that I can see they're saying we're going to do this with this data, and then they do exactly what they've said, and I can see the whole process, and this is consistently happening over time, as time progresses, I start to begin to be like, okay, I can trust them, and then you can trust them with a little bit more information, a little bit more data, and then you continue to treat that data with respect, and that's how you build trust. Consistency over time.
I love that. Trust is consistency over time. That is So well put. And I think it's a difficult thing, especially in the startup world, right? Because everybody comes out the gates and is like, we want to, we're trustworthy and we're doing this better. But actually, until people experience that from you, from regular engagements, it's very hard to truly feel that as a client or as a user. So I guess final question from me is how do you see this intersection of mental health specifically in tech evolving in the years to come?
Yeah, interesting that we go from talking about trust to talking about the sort of tech industry at large, because the first thought that comes to mind is that, probably big tech has a bunch of trust to rebuild with people in terms of how it's handling data and so on. But I think it's starting to happen. I think people are starting to understand, okay, this is how technology is. You kind of get to know it a little bit and sort of expect have better expectations of it. Be like, no, actually, I do want you to treat my data with respect, and I do want to have control over what you do with it, and so on. So I'm hoping that this is a trend that continues, and all of us, when we ourselves are the users, continue to hold the products that we use responsible for how they're using our data, and demanding that they are trustworthy over time. How will technology interact with? How will technology play out in the health tech space? I don't know. I'm trying to think without speculating, but I think there's a lot of scope for there's a lot of scope for trying to reach more people more effectively. And one of the analogies I heard a while back, I think it's kind of a good way of thinking about it, is that in an analogy with the language learning space. So, it used to be that if you wanted to learn a new language, you had to go and sit in the room with a tutor. That's how I learned English when I was growing up. It's very much seeing my English teacher week in and week out. And that was the only way you learned, and maybe you picked up a book or you watched some cartoons or something. And that's how you learned the language. And then CDs came along, and then they made that way more accessible to way more people. You go and buy a CD and you listen to it, and you learn the language without necessarily having to have a human teacher in the room. And that suddenly made language learning accessible to millions and millions of people. And it was like an exciting new generation of tools in that space. But then a third wave came along, which was the language learning apps. I'm using Memrise at the moment, for example, to learn Korean. And what the language learning apps is, what they did is that they tried to take that to the next level. So they took it from millions of people buying CDs to learn a language, where you still had to be pretty committed to the endeavor to invest in the CDs and then apply yourself to doing them. They took that and they broke it down and they gamified it, they made it really fun, and then suddenly they were able to reach an order of magnitude more people. And this is the world we're living in today. Now, if you kind of think of the parallel, what would be the equivalent of that in health tech? Something like that. It's like you kind of start with the old school therapist. Freud is sitting there with his clients, like one-to-one in the same room, and that's the only way you can get therapy. To therapy moves online, and you have a bit like with the CDs, you're suddenly being able to reach way more people. It's a lot more convenient, and you make that available to lots more people. But then the question is, okay, but what's the third generation set of tools looking like? And I think that's the one where you're able to take 1 minute of a therapist time and transform it into more than 1 minute of a person's value that they can get out of it. And this is kind of what technology is known for being good at, is making things more efficient and changing by an order of magnitude how much value you can extract from the same amount of input. So hopefully that's where we're heading. Fingers crossed.
I think that is such a great parallel, and really importantly here as well, it's what you guys are doing and why the tech element and how that helps accelerate support around all things mental health and well-being is that it genuinely can start to democratize access, to serve more people, and for those who wouldn't have been able to afford it or feel that they were able to have access to it previously. So I think it's definitely going to be a trend that we see continuing, and as long as companies such as Spill are building with design ethics and sort of product ethics and clients' best needs at the heart, then yeah, very excited to see how this intersects.
Fingers crossed. I mean, that's why our mission statement is high quality therapy in the pocket of every person on earth. I think I really resonate with what you said about democratizing access to this stuff in therapy. Historically a very elite the type of product, and it's so valuable that honestly very exciting to think of getting it in the hands of millions and millions of people. When my more kind of starry-eyed moments, I kind of think if you get this into the hands of enough people and enough people access the benefit of what therapy gives you, maybe you reach a tipping point where you start seeing the effects of that, like the shift in the culture at large. We all become a kind of more compassionate and joyful species. I don't know.
I mean, that's something the world could definitely do with. Maria, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fascinating. If you have not checked out Spill, you can do so at spill.chat. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you for having me.